The metal door of Unit 247 rolled up with a screech that cut through the morning air like a rusted blade. Marcus stepped back as the stale scent of abandonment washed over him, dust, mildew, and something else he couldn't quite place. The other bidders had already moved on to the next unit, their footsteps echoing off concrete as they chased bigger scores. Marcus was alone with his $10 gamble. The unit stretched back 12 feet, packed floor to ceiling with the archaeological layers of someone's life. Cardboard boxes sagged under the weight of neglect, their corners soft with moisture damage. A velvet armchair sat tilted on 3 legs, its burgundy fabric faded to the color of dried blood. Christmas decorations spilled from torn garbage bags like confetti from a decades-old celebration. Marcus pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. The LED beam cut through the gloom, revealing more of the same: broken picture frames, a child's bicycle with flat tires, towers of yellowed newspapers. His heart sank. This wasn't treasure, this was someone's discarded past, and he'd just spent grocery money on garbage. He squeezed between the boxes, making his way toward the back wall. The air grew thicker, heavy with dust that made him cough. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a collapsed bookshelf, something caught his eye. A leather trunk, its brass corners green with oxidation but still solid-looking. Unlike everything else in the unit, it had been carefully wrapped in plastic sheeting. Marcus checked his watch. The facility would close the unit if he didn't start removing items soon, and he needed time to sort through everything before the day's heat became unbearable. Already, sweat was beading on his forehead, and it wasn't even 7 a.m. He pulled out his pocket knife and carefully slit the plastic around the trunk. The leather was cracked but intact, and when he lifted the lid, the hinges moved smoothly, as if someone had maintained them recently. Inside, nestled in faded velvet compartments, were dozens of photograph albums and manila folders filled with documents. The first album fell open to a page of black and white photographs from what looked like the 1980s. Phoenix society events, charity galas, country club gatherings, political fundraisers, men in tuxedos and women in evening gowns, frozen in time with champagne glasses raised and practiced smiles. But these weren't the usual family snapshots he'd expected to find in abandoned storage. These were professional shots, the kind taken by society photographers for newspaper coverage. Each photo was carefully labeled in elegant handwriting: Metropolitan Club Annual Gala, April 1987, Phoenix Children's Hospital Benefit, June 1987, Thunderbird Country Club Championship, August 1987. Marcus flipped through more pages, his fraud investigator instincts stirring despite himself. Why would someone keep such meticulous records of social events, and why wrap them so carefully while letting everything else in the unit decay? In the second album, he found his answer. The photographs were different here, candid shots taken from a distance, many with telephoto lenses. People entering hotels, getting into cars, meeting in parking lots. The elegant handwriting continued, but now the captions read like surveillance notes: JH and CM at Biltmore, 2:30 p.m., DK leaving residence, 6:45 a.m., payment received, Camelback location. A chill ran down Marcus's spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. These weren't social photographs. They were evidence, documentation. Someone had been watching Phoenix's elite, recording their movements, their meetings, their secrets. He opened one of the manila folders and found newspaper clippings about the disappearance of Victoria Ashford, the 23-year-old heiress who'd vanished in late 1987. Marcus remembered the case vaguely. It had been front-page news for weeks. Victoria was set to inherit $50 million on her 24th birthday, but she'd disappeared just 3 months before, leaving behind only a note saying she needed to find herself. The official story was that she'd run away to Europe, overwhelmed by the pressure of sudden wealth. Her trust fund had eventually been dissolved and distributed to various charities, but here, mixed in with the photographs, was a copy of what looked like a private investigator's report, stamped confidential and dated 2 weeks after Victoria's disappearance. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he read the first page. According to the report, Victoria had been asking questions about her father's business dealings in the weeks before she vanished. She'd hired the PI to investigate possible connections between her family's construction company and several suspicious deaths of environmental activists who'd opposed development projects. The investigator's conclusion was buried in careful legal language, but Marcus's trained eye caught the implications immediately. Victoria Ashford hadn't run away to find herself. She'd stumbled onto something that powerful people wanted to keep buried, and she'd paid the price. Marcus closed the folder, his mind racing. Someone had preserved this evidence for over 30 years, keeping it hidden but safe. Someone who knew the truth about Victoria Ashford's disappearance. And now, by random chance and desperate circumstance, it had fallen into his hands. The question was, what was he supposed to do with it? Marcus sat in his truck outside the storage facility for 20 minutes, the trunk secured in the passenger seat like a ticking bomb. The Arizona sun was climbing higher, already turning the cab into an oven, but he couldn't bring himself to start the engine. His hands still shook from what he'd read, and his mind kept circling back to the same impossible question. After 32 years of bureaucratic dead ends and corporate cover-ups, how was he supposed to trust that this evidence would matter to anyone who could actually do something about it? But Emma would be waking up soon, expecting breakfast before her summer camp. The ordinary world was calling him back. Marcus finally turned the key and drove the familiar route home through neighborhoods that grew progressively shabbier. Manicured lawns gave way to chain-link fences and brown patches of desert reclaiming abandoned lots. His apartment complex sat like a faded afterthought on the edge of town. Sunrise Gardens, though Marcus had never seen a garden there, and the sunrise only served to highlight the peeling paint and broken playground equipment. He carried the trunk up 2 flights of stairs, past Mrs. Chen's door where the smell of cooking rice always lingered, past the unit where the college kids played music too loud, to apartment 2C home. The word felt increasingly hollow these days. Emma was already awake, sitting at their small kitchen table with a bowl of off-brand cereal, still in her pajamas with her dark hair tangled from sleep. At 12, she was beginning to look more like her mother every day. The same serious eyes, the same stubborn set to her jaw when she was thinking hard about something. "You're late," she said, without looking up from her phone. "Camp starts at 8:30. "Found some things to sort through," Marcus said, setting the trunk down by the couch. "Give me 5 minutes to grab a shower, then I'll drive you." Emma glanced at the trunk, then at him. She had an unsettling ability to read his moods, probably developed from years of watching him navigate one crisis after another. "Is it worth anything?" The question hung in the air between them. Everything in their lives came down to that calculation now. Rent money, grocery money, gas money to get to his 3 jobs. Marcus thought about Victoria Ashford, about $50 million that had disappeared along with a young woman who'd asked the wrong questions. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. In the shower, Marcus let the lukewarm water wash away the dust from the storage unit, but it couldn't clean the growing anxiety from his thoughts. He'd been an insurance investigator for 15 years before everything fell apart. He knew how to read evidence, how to follow paper trails, how to spot the patterns that revealed when powerful people were lying. Those skills had made him good at his job. They'd also made him unemployable. The scandal had started small, a workers' compensation claim that didn't add up. Marcus had followed the inconsistencies until he uncovered a network of fraudulent claims worth millions, all connected to construction companies owned by some of Phoenix's most prominent families. He'd done everything by the book, documented every connection, presented his findings to his supervisors with unshakable evidence. 6 weeks later, he was fired for falsifying reports. The investigation was buried, the evidence disappeared, and Marcus found himself blacklisted from every insurance company in the state. The message was clear: some truths were too expensive to acknowledge. He dressed quickly and drove Emma to camp at the community center, watching her join a group of kids clustered around picnic tables in whatever shade they could find. She waved goodbye without the self-consciousness that would probably come in another year or two, still young enough to be unself-conscious about having a father who worked 3 jobs and drove a truck with a broken air conditioner. "Pick you up at 3, he called. His first job was at a warehouse on the industrial side of town. moving inventory for an auto parts distributor, 8 hours of lifting boxes in 100-degree heat, alongside men who'd learned not to ask too many questions about each other's past. The work was mindless enough that his thoughts kept drifting back to the trunk, to the careful documentation of Phoenix society's secrets. During his lunch break, Marcus called his second job to confirm his evening shift at the security company. 5 hours of watching empty office buildings, making rounds every hour, logging everything in reports that no one would ever read. Then, if he was lucky, he'd get home by midnight and grab 4 hours of sleep before his morning shift, delivering auto parts across the valley. It was sustainable, barely. The 3 jobs covered rent and utilities, with enough left over for Emma's basics and occasional trips to the movies when he wanted to pretend they were living instead of just surviving. But there was no margin for error, no savings for emergencies, no money for the things that would give Emma the future she deserved. As he drove home that evening, Marcus found himself thinking about Victoria Ashford again. She'd been Emma's age when her father died, when she'd inherited a fortune that should have guaranteed her security forever. Instead, her questions about corruption and murder had gotten her killed. The trunk sat waiting in his living room, full of evidence that could expose the truth about her death. But Marcus had learned the hard way what happened to people who told inconvenient truths about powerful families. The question wasn't what was in the trunk. The question was whether he could afford to ignore it. Marcus stared at the trunk for a long moment after Emma went to bed, the weight of the day's routine settling around him like chains. The evening news droned in the background. Another corporate merger, another politician's promise, another story about Phoenix's booming economy that somehow never seemed to reach apartments like theirs. He muted the television and opened the trunk again. The photograph albums lay exactly where he'd left them, but now he noticed something he'd missed in the storage unit's dim light. Tucked into the velvet lining was a narrow pocket containing a single manila envelope, unmarked and sealed. Marcus hesitated, then carefully opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter on expensive stationery, dated October 15, 1987, 2 weeks after Victoria Ashford's disappearance. The elegant script was the same as the photograph captions, but the tone was urgent, desperate. If you're reading this, then something has happened to me. I've tried to do the right thing, tried to get someone in authority to listen, but they're all connected. The construction contracts, the environmental impact studies, the permits that got fast-tracked, it's all tied together. My father wasn't just building shopping centers and golf courses, he was helping them cover up the contamination, helping them silence anyone who might expose what they dumped in the desert. 3 people are dead because they tried to stop it, and now they know I have the proof. I thought I could trust Detective Morrison, but I saw him at the Camelback Inn yesterday with David Kellner. They know I hired a private investigator. They know I have the photographs. I'm going to try to get the evidence to someone outside Phoenix, someone they can't buy or threaten. If I don't make it, please don't let their deaths be meaningless. The families of those activists deserve to know the truth. The city deserves to know what's buried under all that new development. Fifth. Marcus read the letter 3 times, his investigator's mind automatically cataloging the implications. Victoria hadn't Ashford just stumbled onto corruption, she'd uncovered a murder conspiracy. And now he was holding the evidence she died trying to expose. His phone buzzed with a text message. "Unknown number, some things are better left buried, Mr. Rivera." The blood drained from Marcus's face. He looked around his apartment, suddenly aware of how exposed they were on the second floor, how thin the walls were, how easily someone could have been watching. He moved to the window and peered through the blinds. The parking lot looked normal. A few residents coming home from late shifts, the usual scatter of cars under the yellow security lights. Another text, "You have something that doesn't belong to you. Check your daughter's backpack." Marcus's hands trembled as he rushed to Emma's room. She was sleeping peacefully, one arm thrown over her pillow, dark hair spread across her face. Her backpack sat by the dresser where she'd dropped it after camp. Inside, tucked between her sketchpad and water bottle, was a photograph, a picture of Emma at the community center that morning, standing with her friends by the picnic tables. A red circle had been drawn around her face. The message was unmistakably clear. Marcus backed out of Emma's room, closing the door quietly, his mind racing through possibilities. How did they know he had the trunk? How did they get Emma's photo so quickly? The storage facility had cameras, and his credit card would have recorded the payment for the unit. In the digital age, privacy was an illusion, especially when powerful people wanted to find you. He returned to the living room and stared at the trunk. 32 years ago, Victoria Ashford had tried to expose the truth and ended up dead. The police investigation had been compromised from the beginning. The evidence had been buried along with her. Now, through pure chance, that evidence had surfaced again, and the same people who'd killed her were still alive, still powerful, still willing to murder to protect their secrets. But they'd made a mistake. They'd threatened Emma. Marcus thought about his daughter sleeping in the next room, trusting him to keep her safe in a world that had already taken her mother and her father's career. He thought about Victoria Ashford, dead at 23, because she'd tried to seek justice for people whose only crime was caring about the environment. He thought about the activists whose murders had been covered up, their families never knowing the truth about why they died. The smart thing would be to drive to Desert Star Storage in the morning and put everything back in Unit 247. Walk away. Keep his head down. Protect Emma by choosing ignorance. But as Marcus looked at the photograph of his daughter with the red circle around her face, he realized they'd already made that choice impossible. They'd brought Emma into this the moment they threatened her, and unlike 32 years ago, they weren't dealing with a naive heiress who trusted the system to protect her. They were dealing with a man who had nothing left to lose except the one thing he'd die to protect. Marcus closed the trunk and began planning his next move. Marcus sat frozen at his kitchen table, the photograph of Emma still clutched in his trembling hands. The red circle around his daughter's face seemed to pulse in the dim lamplight, a target that made his stomach churn with a fear deeper than anything he'd felt since the night they'd lost Sarah to cancer. "What are you doing?" The voice in his head sounded like his ex-supervisor at the insurance company, the same tone that had delivered his termination notice with bureaucratic politeness. "You know how this ends. You've already lived through it once." Marcus set the photograph down and rubbed his eyes. The smart play was obvious. Return the trunk, apologize for any misunderstanding, go back to his 3 jobs and the crushing routine that at least kept Emma safe. He'd built their entire life around staying invisible, avoiding attention, keeping his head down. It had worked for 3 years. They were poor but safe, struggling but together. But now that safety was an illusion, shattered by whoever had taken that photograph and slipped it into his 12-year-old daughter's backpack. He walked to the living room window and checked the parking lot again. A sedan he didn't recognize sat under a broken streetlight, dark enough that he couldn't make out if anyone was inside. It could be nothing. Residents had friends, people worked late shifts, cars broke down. But Marcus had learned to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming that he was being watched. The trunk sat on his coffee table like evidence at a crime scene, which, he supposed, it was. 32 years of evidence, carefully preserved by someone who'd known the truth about Victoria Ashford's murder. Someone who'd kept the secret all these years, waiting for what? Justice? Revenge? Or just the right moment when the old guard might finally be vulnerable? Marcus opened one of the photo albums again and studied the surveillance shots. The handwriting identifying the subjects was meticulous, professional, JH and CM at Biltmore. He'd worked enough insurance fraud cases to recognize the pattern. Someone had been building a case, documenting meetings, tracking connections. But who? A private investigator, a journalist, a CO conspirator who'd grown a conscience. The implications made his chest tight. If Victoria Ashford had been murdered for asking questions about environmental cover-ups and corrupt construction contracts, then this evidence could expose crimes worth millions, maybe billions. Phoenix's development boom in the 80s had created fortunes that still shape the city's power structure. The families involved wouldn't just be wealthy, they'd be embedded in every level of government, law enforcement, and media. Marcus thought about his own experience with those connections. The workers' compensation fraud he'd uncovered had led to prominent construction companies, the same kind of businesses that might have been involved in Victoria's investigation. He'd followed the evidence professionally, documented everything according to protocol, trusted the system to handle the truth responsibly. 6 weeks later, his career was over and his reputation destroyed. The message had been clear: some truths were too expensive to acknowledge. And now he was facing the same choice Victoria Ashford had faced 32 years ago, except the stakes were even higher. She'd only had her own life to worry about. He had Emma. Marcus walked to his daughter's bedroom door and listened to her steady breathing. Tomorrow she'd wake up expecting him to drive her to camp, then pick her up at 3 o'clock. Like always, she'd want to tell him about her day, about whatever art project they were working on, about which kids were being mean and which ones made her laugh. She trusted him to maintain the small, safe world they'd built together after Sarah died. But that world was already compromised. Whoever had taken her photograph knew where she went to camp, knew her daily routine, knew exactly how to hurt Marcus where it would matter most. They demonstrated their reach and their willingness to involve an innocent child in their threats. "You're not an investigator anymore," he reminded himself. "You're a warehouse worker who moves boxes for 8 hours a day. You're a security guard who watches empty buildings all night. You're a delivery driver who can't afford to miss a day of work." The rational part of his mind cataloged all the ways this could go wrong. He had no resources, no connections, no credibility with law enforcement. The people who'd destroyed his career 3 years ago were probably the same ones threatening Emma now. Even if he found someone willing to listen, how long would it take for word to get back to the wrong people? How long before Emma's photograph moved from a warning to something worse? But the photograph albums told a different story. One of careful documentation, patient investigation, evidence preserved against impossible odds. Someone had spent years building this case, risking everything to keep the truth alive. And now, by pure chance, it had landed in the hands of a man who understood exactly what they'd been trying to accomplish. Marcus closed the album and stared at his reflection in the darkened window. Behind the glass, the unknown sedan still sat in the parking lot, waiting. The choice wasn't really whether to investigate the evidence in the trunk. The choice was whether to let Emma grow up in a world where powerful people could murder idealistic young women and threaten children to cover their crimes, or to finally draw a line and fight back, even if it destroyed them both. Marcus Rivera had crossed lines before, but never one that felt this permanent. He stood at his kitchen counter at 3 in the morning, a cup of cold coffee forgotten beside his laptop, the ancient machine he'd bought secondhand 2 years ago and used mainly for Emma's school projects. Now its blue glow illuminated something far different, a methodical search for every piece of information he could find about the people in Victoria Ashford's photographs. J.H. was James Harrison, now 78 years old and chairman emeritus of Harrison Development Group. His company had built half of Scottsdale's luxury resorts in the 80s, along with 3 golf courses that had required massive environmental impact waivers. CM was Charles Morrison, Detective Morrison from Victoria's Letter, who'd retired from Phoenix PD in 1995 and now ran a private security firm that contracted with the same development companies. The connections were still there, 32 years later, still profitable, still worth protecting. Marcus saved everything to a flash drive, then created backup copies. He'd learned that lesson the hard way when his insurance files had mysteriously corrupted the day before his termination hearing. This time, he'd scatter the evidence like seeds, multiple copies hidden in places they couldn't anticipate or control. By dawn, he had a plan that probably qualified as either brilliant or suicidal. He couldn't tell which, but that uncertainty felt familiar. Every meaningful investigation he'd ever conducted had started with that same vertigo, the sense of stepping off a cliff without knowing if there was ground below. Emma found him at the kitchen table when she stumbled out for breakfast, still in her pajamas and squinting against the morning light filtering through their thin curtains. "You're up early," she said, pouring cereal into a bowl with the automatic movements of someone who'd learned to be self-sufficient. "Couldn't sleep." Marcus closed the laptop and studied his daughter's face. 12 years old, Sarah's dark eyes and stubborn chin already showing signs of the intelligence that would either save her or put her in danger. How would you feel about visiting your Aunt Linda for a while? Emma's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. In Tucson? Why? Just thinking it might be nice. She's been asking when you'd come stay again. For how long? Marcus had no answer for that. Until this was over, however it ended. Until the people who'd threatened her were exposed, or until they'd silenced him permanently. Until Emma was safe, or until there was no one left to protect her. Maybe a few weeks, he said instead. Emma set down her spoon and fixed him with the look that always reminded him how much of Sarah lived on in her. Something's wrong. Don't lie to me, Dad. I'm not little anymore. The truth was a luxury Marcus couldn't afford, not when Emma's safety depended on her ignorance. But the lie stuck in his throat as he looked at her. This brave, bright girl who'd already lost her mother and now faced losing her father's presence, if not his life, to a fight that had started before she was born. I found something in that storage unit, he said carefully. Something that might be valuable, but it's also complicated. There are people who don't want me to have it. Bad people? I don't know yet. That's what I need to find out. Emma nodded with the matter-of-fact acceptance that broke Marcus's heart. She'd learned too young that the world was unpredictable, that safety was temporary, that the adults in her life sometimes had to make impossible choices. Aunt Linda has that new pool, she said finally. And her neighborhood has better internet. Yeah, it does. When would I go? Today. That afternoon, Marcus drove Emma to the Greyhound station with a suitcase full of summer clothes and a story about needing time to sort through his work situation. She hugged him goodbye with the fierce intensity of someone who understood that things might be different when they saw each other again. Be careful, Dad, she whispered against his shoulder. Always am. No, you're not. Mom used to worry about that. She said you had a hero complex. Marcus held his daughter tighter, memorizing the weight of her in his arms. Sarah had been right, as usual. The smart thing would be to get on that bus with Emma, disappear into Tucson's sprawling anonymity, find new jobs and build a new life far from Phoenix's buried secrets. But as the bus pulled away with Emma's face pressed to the window, Marcus felt something settle in his chest. A cold clarity he hadn't experienced since the night he'd decided to pursue the workers' compensation fraud despite his supervisor's warnings to let it go. Emma was safe. For the first time in 3 years, he had nothing left to lose. Marcus Rivera walked back to his truck and drove home to declare war on people who thought children were acceptable casualties in their decades-old cover-up. The threshold was crossed. There would be no going back. Marcus returned to his apartment as the sun began its descent toward the Phoenix Mountains, casting long shadows across the parking lot where the unknown sedan had sat the night before. It was gone now, but that didn't mean he wasn't being watched. In his insurance days, he'd learned that surveillance was like a shell game, always shifting, never quite where you expected it. The empty apartment felt cavernous without Emma's presence. Her cereal bowl still sat in the sink, a reminder of the morning's conversation and the choice that had sent his daughter 300 miles away for her own protection. Marcus allowed himself 30 seconds of doubt, then got to work. His first challenge revealed itself immediately when he tried calling the Arizona Republic's investigative desk. The reporter who answered listened politely as Marcus explained he had evidence related to an unsolved murder from 1987. But the conversation died when he mentioned the Harrison and Morrison names. Look, Mr. Rivera, the reporter said, his tone shifting to practice dismissal. We get a lot of calls about old cases. Without corroborating evidence from official sources, there's really nothing we can pursue. Official sources. Marcus almost laughed. The official sources were the problem. He hung up and stared at his list of potential contacts. Journalists, federal investigators, even an FBI field office number he'd found online. But each option carried the same risk. In a city where corruption had roots going back decades, how could he know who was safe to trust? The answer came from an unexpected source. While researching Charles Morrison's private security firm, Marcus had stumbled across a lawsuit filed 6 months earlier by a former Phoenix PD detective named Carmen Santos. She'd been forced into early retirement after investigating connections between city contractors and permit violations, claiming her superiors had buried her reports and transferred her to traffic duty when she refused to back down. If Santos was suing the department, she was already at war with the same system that had protected Victoria Ashford's killers. That made her either an ally or someone with nothing left to lose, either way worth the risk. Marcus found her address through public records and drove to a modest duplex in central Phoenix, his truck's air conditioning fighting a losing battle against the late afternoon heat. Santos answered the door on the second knock, a compact woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that assessed him like a potential threat. Carmen Santos? Depends who's asking. Marcus Rivera. I think we might have something in common. He held up one of the photograph albums from Victoria's trunk. People who don't want us asking questions. Santos studied his face for a long moment, then stepped aside. You better come in before someone sees you. Her living room doubled as a war room. Boxes of files stacked against the walls, newspaper clippings taped to a corkboard, a map of Phoenix marked with colored pins. It looked exactly like Marcus's kitchen table had at 3 that morning, except Santos had been at this much longer. You're the guy from the storage unit, she said, settling into a chair across from him. Word travels fast in this town. Marcus felt ice in his stomach. What word? Harrison Development's been asking questions about Desert Star Storage, specifically about who might have rented Unit 247 over the years. Santos smiled grimly. Lucky for you, the facility owner is my cousin. He gave them the runaround, but they're not going to stop looking. The net was closing faster than Marcus had anticipated. How long do I have? Before they find you? Maybe a day, maybe less. Before they do something about it? Santos gestured at her corkboard. I've been documenting their pattern for 3 years. They don't make threats they're not willing to follow through on. Marcus opened the photograph album and watched Santos's expression change as she recognized the faces. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned pages, studying surveillance photos and documents she'd probably spent years trying to obtain through official channels. Jesus Christ, she whispered. Do you know what this is? Evidence of murder, conspiracy, corruption going back 30 years. It's more than that. Santos stood and walked to her map, pointing at clusters of colored pins. Every major development project in Phoenix since 1985, every environmental waiver that got fast-tracked, every activist group that got infiltrated or disbanded. She turned back to Marcus. This is the roadmap for how they built this city on buried bodies. The weight of Victoria Ashford's evidence settled on Marcus like a physical presence. He'd thought he was holding proof of a single murder conspiracy, but Santos was showing him something larger, a systematic corruption that had shaped an entire city's growth for 3 decades. The question is, Santos continued, what are you planning to do with it? Because once you start this fight, there's no walking away. Marcus thought of Emma's face pressed against the bus window, of Victoria Ashford's letter describing her final desperate attempt to expose the truth, of his own destroyed career and the 3 years he'd spent in exile. They already made that choice for me, he said. They threatened my daughter. Santos nodded slowly. Then, welcome to the war. Santos walked to her kitchen and returned with 2 bottles of beer, the condensation already beating in the dry heat. She handed one to Marcus and settled back into her chair, her expression shifting from surprise to calculation. First thing you need to understand, she said, is that they've had 32 years to perfect this system. Every investigator who's gotten close has either been bought, transferred, or destroyed professionally. The smart ones take the hint and move on. Marcus took a long pull from the beer, feeling the weight of Victoria's evidence in the bag at his feet. What about the stubborn ones? Some end up like me, forced into early retirement, reputation shot, fighting legal battles they can't afford. Santos's voice carried the bitter edge of experience. Others just disappear from the field entirely. New careers, new cities, new lives where they don't ask inconvenient questions. And the ones who won't back down? Santos met his eyes. Victoria Ashford won't back down. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Marcus studied Santos's war room again, noting the methodical organization, the years of accumulated research, the careful documentation of a pattern she'd been tracking alone. "You've been preparing for this," he said, "ever since they buried my investigation into the Camelback Village project. 18 months of work, dozens of interviews, clear evidence of bid rigging and environmental violations." Santos gestured at a thick file box marked CV 2018. "My captain called me in one day and told me the case was being transferred to Internal Affairs for procedural review. 3 weeks later, I was directing traffic at construction sites." Marcus recognized the familiar sting of bureaucratic assassination. "They couldn't fire you outright? 26 years on the force, clean record, too close to pension eligibility. But they could make my life miserable until I quit." Santos smiled grimly. "Problem is, I'm too stubborn for my own good. Started documenting everything they did to silence me. Every case they buried, every investigator they transferred or discredited, building a countercase, building an arsenal. But I was missing the historical context, the original crimes that established the pattern." Santos nodded toward Marcus's bag. "You just brought me the missing piece." Marcus felt the familiar surge of investigative excitement, the same rush he'd experienced when disparate evidence began forming a coherent picture. But it was tempered by hard-earned caution. "What's your plan?" "Federal court in Tucson. Clean jurisdiction, judges who don't owe favors to Phoenix development interests." Santos pulled out a legal pad covered with notes. "I've been building a RICO case, racketeering influenced and corrupt organizations. If we can prove a pattern of criminal enterprise spanning decades, we can bypass local law enforcement entirely. Federal prosecutors will need overwhelming evidence. Testimony from witnesses who can't be discredited, or documentary proof that speaks for itself." Santos gestured toward the photograph albums. "Someone spent years building this case. Professional surveillance, financial records, correspondence. This isn't the work of an amateur or a crank." Marcus thought about the meticulous handwriting, the careful organization, the preservation of evidence across 3 decades. "Any idea who compiled it?" "My guess? Someone inside the system. Someone with access to police files, court records, private communications." Santos opened one of the albums and studied the surveillance photos. "See how these are numbered and dated? That's law enforcement methodology. Whoever did this knew how to build a prosecutable case, but they never brought it forward. Maybe they tried and got shut down. Maybe they were waiting for the right moment, or the right ally." Santos looked up at Marcus. Maybe they died before they could finish what they started. The possibility hung between them like a third presence in the room. Marcus thought about the storage unit rental records, the monthly payments that had continued for over 3 decades. Someone had been protecting this evidence, keeping it safe, waiting. "We need to move fast," Santos continued. "Once Harrison Development realizes you have this, they'll escalate. The subtle approach hasn't worked, threatening your daughter, trying to track you through the storage facility. Next comes direct action." Marcus's chest tightened. "What kind of direct action?" "Depends how desperate they are. Could be legal, framing you for theft, claiming the storage unit contents were stolen property. Could be personal, targeting your employment, your housing, your reputation." Santos's expression darkened. "Could be permanent." The beer turned bitter in Marcus's mouth. He'd sent Emma away to protect her, but he was still one man with no resources facing an organization that had been eliminating threats for over 30 years. "You said there were others," he said. "Other investigators who got close." "A few. Most won't talk. They've moved on, built new lives, don't want to risk everything again." Santos paused. "But there's one who might help. Journalist named Rebecca Chen. She was working on a series about construction corruption when her editor killed the story. She's freelance now, looking for a way back into investigative work." Marcus felt the first stirring of hope since this began. "You trust her?" "I trust that she's angry enough to take the risk." Santos stood and walked to her map, pointing to a cluster of red pins. "The question is whether we can get to her before they get to us." As Marcus reached for his phone to ask about Rebecca Chen's contact information, it rang in his hand. Unknown number, Phoenix area code. His blood turned to ice water. "Don't answer," Santos said, reading his expression. But Marcus was already sliding his thumb across the screen, some masochistic need to know driving him forward. "Mr. Rivera." The voice was cultured, calm, the kind of tone that suggested expensive suits and corner offices. "My name is David Harrison. I believe you have something that belongs to my family." Santos was already moving, pulling out her own phone and starting what looked like a recording app. Marcus forced his voice to remain steady. "I think you have the wrong number. Unit 247 at Desert Star Storage, purchased yesterday for $10. Rather modest investment for such valuable contents." Harrison's tone never wavered. "I'm prepared to offer you $50,000 for the return of certain items. Cash transaction, no questions asked." The number hit Marcus like a physical blow. $50,000, enough to pay off his debts, get Emma into better schools, maybe even start over somewhere new. The exact amount he'd calculated they needed to escape their financial spiral. "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said. A pause. When Harrison spoke again, the temperature in his voice had dropped 20 degrees. "Mr. Rivera, I'm offering you an opportunity to resolve this matter quietly and profitably. I suggest you consider the alternatives." "What alternatives?" "Your daughter Emma. Lovely girl. Very bright, according to her teachers at Sunnydale Middle School. Currently staying with her Aunt Linda in Tucson, 1247 Desert Willow Drive, Unit 3 Billions. Harrison let that sink in. "She's safe, of course, for now, but accidents happen. Children get lost. Sometimes they never find their way home." Marcus's vision tunneled. The careful control he'd maintained shattered like glass. "If you touch her—" "I won't touch anyone, Mr. Rivera. I'm a businessman, not a criminal. But I can't speak for everyone in this organization. Some of my associates have less patience for negotiation." Santos was frantically writing notes, gesturing for Marcus to keep talking. But Marcus's mind had gone blank except for one thought. They knew where Emma was. Despite all his precautions, despite sending her 300 miles away, they'd found her within hours. "What do you want?" he managed. "A simple exchange. The photographs, documents, and any copies you may have made returned to their rightful owners. In exchange, you receive compensation for your trouble and the assurance that this matter ends here. And if I refuse? Then this becomes a legal matter. Theft of private property, possession of stolen goods. I imagine the police will find evidence of other crimes when they search your residence, perhaps something related to your previous employment difficulties." The frame job Santos had warned about. Marcus realized they'd probably been planning this since the moment they discovered the storage unit was compromised. Plant drugs or stolen property in his apartment, then use his prior scandal to ensure no one questioned his guilt. "You have until midnight to decide," Harrison continued. "Call this number when you're ready to be reasonable. And, Mr. Rivera, I strongly advise against involving law enforcement. Some of our mutual friends in the Phoenix Police Department might feel obligated to expedite your arrest." The line went dead. Marcus stared at his phone, his hands shaking with rage and terror. Emma's face floated in his mind, trusting, brave, completely vulnerable 300 miles away where he couldn't protect her. "They know where she is," he said. "I sent her away and they found her anyway." Santos was already on her own phone. "Linda Martinez, 1247 Desert Willow Drive. I'm calling the Tucson PD, requesting a welfare check." "Will that help?" "Maybe. Or it might escalate things." Santos looked up from her phone. "Marcus, you need to understand, they just showed you their entire hand. They know about Emma's location, they have corrupt cops ready to frame you, and they're confident enough to make direct threats. That means they're either desperate or they think they've already won." Marcus felt the walls closing in. $50,000 versus Emma's safety versus a 30-year conspiracy that had claimed Victoria Ashford's life. The choice should have been simple. Take the money, destroy the evidence, disappear with his daughter, and never look back. But as he stared at Santos's war room, at the years of documented corruption, At the photographs that represented Victoria's final desperate attempt at justice, Marcus realized the terrible truth: there was no safe choice. These people had eliminated threats for 3 decades. Taking their money wouldn't guarantee Emma's safety. It would just prove they could buy him. "We need Chen," he said, "tonight. Because if we don't move first, by tomorrow there won't be anyone left to move." Santos nodded grimly. "Then we better hope she's as angry as I think she is." Santos was dialing Rebecca Chen's number when Marcus's phone rang again. This time the display showed a number he recognized: Linda's landline in Tucson. "Marcus?" His sister-in-law's voice was tight with panic. "The police were just here asking about Emma. They said there was a welfare check request, but then they started asking strange questions about you. About whether you'd been in trouble lately, whether Emma seemed afraid of you." Marcus's blood turned to ice. "Where's Emma now?" "Right here beside me." "She's fine, but Marcus, these weren't normal welfare check questions. They wanted to know if you'd given us anything to hold, any packages or documents. When I said no, they asked to search the apartment." "Did you let them?" "I told them to come back with a warrant." Linda's voice dropped to a whisper. "But Marcus, one of them showed me a photograph of you coming out of some storage facility. He said you might be involved in something illegal." Santos was shaking her head frantically, drawing a finger across her throat. "Get them out of there," she mouthed. "Now." "Linda, listen to me very carefully," Marcus said. "Take Emma and leave the apartment right now. Go to your sister's house in Mesa. Don't pack anything, don't tell anyone where you're going. Drive straight there and wait for me to call." "Marcus, you're scaring me. What's going on?" "I'll explain everything later. Please, just trust me. Go now." He hung up as Santos finished her own call. "Chen's not answering. Her roommate says she left this morning for some kind of research trip. Won't be back until tomorrow night." "Tomorrow night?" Marcus felt the walls closing in completely. "We don't have that long. There's something else." Santos was studying her phone with a grim expression. "My cousin at Desert Star Storage just texted. Harrison Development showed up an hour ago with a court order claiming theft of private property. They're seizing everything from Unit 247. Marcus stared at her. "Everything?" "Every photograph, every document, every piece of evidence Victoria Ashford collected." Santos looked up from her phone. "It gets worse." The court order was signed by Judge Patricia Morrison. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Morrison. Related to Charles Morrison from the construction firm? His wife. Appointed to the bench in 1995, right after her husband's company got the contract for the new courthouse. Santos's voice was bitter with resignation. "The system protects itself, Marcus. Always has." Marcus felt 30 years of careful planning crumble around him. Victoria Ashford's evidence, the surveillance photos, the financial records, the careful documentation of murder and corruption, was gone. Seized by the very system it was meant to expose, buried again beneath layers of legal protection. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Check your email. DH." With trembling fingers, Marcus opened his email app. The message contained a single attachment, a video file. He pressed play and felt his world collapse. The footage was grainy but clear enough. Emma walking out of Linda's apartment building that morning, backpack slung over her shoulder. The timestamp showed 8:47 a.m. A man in a baseball cap approached her on the sidewalk, showing her something on his phone. Emma looked confused, then concerned. She followed him toward a dark sedan parked at the curb. The video ended. Marcus's hands were shaking so violently he nearly dropped the phone. "They have her," he whispered. "They took Emma." Santos grabbed the phone, watching the video with professional eyes. "This was filmed this morning, before your sister-in-law called, before the fake welfare check." Her face was pale. "Marcus, this was planned. They were never going to honor any deal." Another text message appeared. "The girl is safe for now. Midnight deadline still stands. Come alone to Harrison Development, 2400 North Central Avenue. Bring nothing. Tell no one. Any deviation and she disappears forever." Marcus felt something break inside his chest. All his careful planning, all his attempts to protect Emma, All his dreams of using Victoria's evidence to build a better life, it meant nothing. They had his daughter. They had the evidence. They had won. "I have to go," he said, standing on unsteady legs. "Marcus, no, it's a trap. They'll kill you both. They already have Emma. What choice do I have?" Santos grabbed his arm. "We can still fight this. Call the FBI, call the media, make so much noise they can't risk hurting her." "With what evidence?" "They seized everything. Chen's not available. Your cousin can't help us." Marcus pulled free. "It's over, Carmen. They were always 3 steps ahead. I was an idiot to think I could take on 30 years of corruption with some old photographs." He walked toward the door, feeling like a dead man. Behind him, Santos called his name, but the sound seemed to come from very far away. The summer heat hit him like a wall as he stepped outside, but Marcus barely felt it. He had 6 hours until midnight, 6 hours to figure out how to save his daughter's life with nothing left to bargain except his own. Marcus sat in his truck outside Santos's apartment, the engine ticking as it cooled in the desert heat. 6 hours until midnight. 6 hours to save Emma with no leverage, no evidence, no allies. The video of his daughter being taken played on endless loop in his mind, her confused expression, her trusting compliance, the way she disappeared into that sedan without understanding the danger. He pulled out his phone and stared at David Harrison's number. The smart move would be surrender. Walk into Harrison Development at midnight, accept whatever fate they'd planned, and hope they'd honor their word about Emma's safety. But 30 years as an investigator had taught him one unshakable truth: organizations that killed to protect their secrets didn't leave witnesses. The phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Check the glove compartment. A friend." Marcus's blood chilled. Someone had been in his truck. His hand moved instinctively to the glove compartment latch, then stopped. What if it was a bomb, a tracking device, another layer of Harrison's psychological warfare? But as he sat paralyzed by indecision, a memory surfaced from his insurance investigation days, a case involving stolen art where the thieves had made one critical mistake. They'd assumed they controlled all the variables. The insurance company had won because someone unexpected had been watching, documenting, waiting for the right moment to act. Marcus opened the glove compartment. Inside was a manila envelope containing a single photograph and a handwritten note. The photograph showed him and Santos through her apartment window earlier that evening, their heads bent over Victoria's evidence. The image was crisp, professional, taken with a telephoto lens from significant distance. The note was written in the same careful handwriting he'd seen in Victoria's files. "They don't know about the copies. Building 400, Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. Hangar 7, combination 1987. You have 1 hour before they realize the storage unit seizure was incomplete." Marcus stared at the note, his mind racing. Someone else was involved. Someone who'd been watching Harrison Development as closely as they'd been watching him. Someone who'd anticipated the seizure and prepared for it. The handwriting clicked into place with sudden, devastating clarity. He'd seen it before, not just in Victoria's files, but in police reports Santos had shown him. Careful block letters, methodical organization, professional attention to detail. Detective Ray Castellanos, Santos's former partner who died of a heart attack 6 months ago. Marcus's hands trembled as the implications crashed over him. Castellanos hadn't died of natural causes. He'd been eliminated just like Victoria Ashford, just like anyone who got too close to the truth. But before they killed him, he'd made copies, hidden them, set up a dead man switch. The timeline made terrible sense now. Castellanos dies in February. The storage unit payments stop in March when whoever was maintaining Victoria's evidence realizes they're compromised. Marcus buys the unit in July, triggering Harrison's response and Castellanos's contingency plan simultaneously. He was never meant to fight this battle alone. Marcus started the truck and pulled into traffic, his mind finally clear for the first time in 3 days. Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport was 20 minutes away. Harrison Development thought they'd seized all the evidence, but they'd only gotten the original cache. Castellanos had been building his own case file, using Victoria's evidence as a foundation but expanding it with modern surveillance techniques, digital documentation, recorded conversations. The dead cop had left him an arsenal. As Marcus drove through the Phoenix heat, he began to understand the true scope of what Victoria Ashford had started in 1987. She hadn't just been investigating her own family's corruption, she'd been building a network, passing information to police contacts, journalists, federal investigators, creating a web of evidence that couldn't be eliminated by killing any single person. Castellanos had inherited that network. Santos was part of it, probably Chen too, a constellation of investigators working parallel cases, each holding pieces of the larger puzzle, each protected by the other's knowledge. But Harrison Development had been patient, systematic. They'd identified the network members one by one, eliminated them through transfers, career destruction, and ultimately murder. Castellanos had been the last original member alive, and when they'd finally moved against him, he'd triggered the final protocol. Release everything to a civilian outside their sphere of influence. Someone desperate enough to take the risk but clean enough to be believed. Marcus Rivera, former insurance investigator, single father, the perfect combination of skills and motivation. He pulled into the airport service road as the sun touched the western horizon, painting the sky the color of dried blood. Hangar 7 stood in the distance like a monument to secrets 30 years in the making. For the first time since this began, Marcus allowed himself to feel something besides fear. Emma was still in danger, still needed rescue, but he was no longer fighting alone against impossible odds. He was the inheritor of Victoria Ashford's final gambit, and the game was far from over. Marcus parked outside Hangar 7 as airport security lights flickered to life across the tarmac. The combination, 1987, Victoria's disappearance year, opened the personnel door with a soft click that seemed to echo through 30 years of silence. Inside, motion sensor lights revealed Detective Ray Castellanos' true legacy. Not the bitter, burned-out cop Santos remembered, but a methodical architect of justice who'd spent his final years building an unassailable case. Metal shelving lined the walls, filled with bankers' boxes labeled by year and subject. Digital equipment hummed quietly in climate-controlled cabinets. A computer workstation dominated the center space, multiple monitors displaying what looked like a surveillance network still running 6 months after its creator's death. Marcus approached the main terminal, where a sticky note bearing his name was attached to the monitor. The screen showed a simple menu: Welcome, Marcus Rivera. Select option 1, Emma's location 2, Harrison evidence 3, network contacts 4, extraction protocol. His finger hovered over option 1, but Castellanos had anticipated that too. A second note read, Watch the Harrison video first. You need to understand what you're really fighting. Marcus clicked option 2. The screen filled with hours of covertly recorded meetings, phone conversations, and surveillance footage. David Harrison wasn't just a businessman protecting family secrets. He was the operational head of a criminal organization that had evolved far beyond its origins. Construction contracts were just one revenue stream. They controlled city planning decisions, manipulated real estate developments, and eliminated anyone who threatened their carefully constructed ecosystem of corruption. The footage of Victoria Ashford's murder was there, recorded by a traffic camera Castellanos had somehow accessed. She hadn't been killed at the construction site. They'd brought her body there afterward, staging the scene to look like an accident. The actual murder had taken place in a warehouse, a clinical execution carried out by men in business suits who discussed it like a budget meeting. But the revelation that staggered Marcus came in a recording dated just 3 months ago. David Harrison's voice, calm and businesslike. The Rivera situation needs to be managed carefully. He's already demonstrated investigative skills. If we can't control him, we eliminate him and use the daughter as an example. Make sure everyone understands what happens to people who ask the wrong questions. They'd been planning this since before Marcus ever bought the storage unit. The whole sequence, the abandoned unit, his desperation bid, the discovery of the evidence, had been orchestrated. Harrison Development had been looking for someone to blame for Victoria's disappearance, a scapegoat they could eliminate while recovering the evidence and demonstrating their reach to any other potential threats. Marcus was never meant to survive this, but Castellanos had built safeguards. Option 3 revealed a network of contacts that made Santos's operation look small-scale. Federal investigators, journalists, prosecutors in other states, even international law enforcement agencies tracking financial crimes. Each had pieces of the larger puzzle. Each was prepared to act if the others were compromised. More importantly, they were all still alive because Harrison Development didn't know they existed. Marcus clicked option 4 and watched a pre-recorded video of Detective Castellanos, looking haggard but determined. If you're seeing this, it means they've taken your daughter and think they hold all the cards. They're wrong. Emma Rivera is being held at the Morrison construction site on South Mountain, the same location where they killed Victoria Ashford. Poetic justice, Harrison would call it. Stupid pattern recognition, I call it. The screen displayed detailed schematics of the construction site, security camera locations, guard rotations, and multiple escape routes. I've been watching this place for 2 years. 3 guards, minimal electronic surveillance, 1 access road. They're overconfident because they've never been challenged. Castellanos leaned closer to the camera. Here's what they don't know. Rebecca Chen has been working undercover for the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force. Carmen Santos has been feeding information to federal prosecutors, and you, Marcus Rivera, are about to become the most protected witness in Arizona history. A new menu appeared. Activate network? Warning: this action cannot be undone. Once initiated, Harrison Development will be under federal investigation within 6 hours. Marcus stared at the screen, understanding the weight of the decision. Activating Castellanos' network would save Emma and destroy Harrison Development, but it would also expose him to federal scrutiny. His past insurance investigation scandal would be examined, his desperate financial situation questioned, his every decision since buying the storage unit analyzed. But Emma was alive. The construction site was 20 miles away, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Marcus had allies. He clicked Activate Network and watched as secure communications began streaming across the monitor. FBI agents receiving alerts, prosecutors opening sealed files, journalists accessing encrypted documents. Victoria Ashford's 30-year fight for justice was about to end, and Marcus Rivera would be the one to finish it. The communications network erupted into activity across all 6 monitors. Text messages, encrypted files, and secure video calls cascaded down the screens as Marcus watched 30 years of dormant evidence spring to life. Federal agents in 3 states received notification packets. Investigative journalists opened encrypted drives containing financial records and recorded conversations. Prosecutors who'd spent years building related cases suddenly had the missing pieces they needed. But Marcus barely registered the digital symphony of justice awakening around him. Emma was 20 miles away, held at a construction site by men who'd killed to protect their secrets for 3 decades. Every minute he spent in this hangar was another minute his daughter remained in mortal danger. He grabbed the tactical gear Castellanos had left in a nearby locker: night vision scope, tactical vest, portable radio tuned to FBI frequencies. The detective had thought of everything, down to a Glock 19 with 3 magazines and a suppressor. Marcus hefted the weapon, muscle memory from his insurance investigation days kicking in. He'd never shot anyone, but he'd trained for situations that required armed response. Tonight, that training might save his daughter's life. The radio crackled as he reached his truck. Phoenix base to desert units? We have federal authorization for tactical response. Target is Morrison Construction, South Mountain facility. Approach with extreme caution. Civilian hostage confirmed on site. Marcus's hands shook as he started the engine. The network was moving faster than he'd expected. FBI units were already mobilizing, which meant he had maybe an hour before the site became a federal crime scene, an hour to reach Emma before tactical teams surrounded the compound and turned a rescue into a standoff. He floored the accelerator, racing through Phoenix streets as radio chatter filled the cab. Santos's voice cut through the static. Rivera, if you're monitoring this frequency, do not attempt solo extraction. Federal units are 15 minutes out. Repeat, Do not engage alone. But Marcus was already committed to a path that had started 3 days ago in a dusty storage unit. He'd spent his adult life investigating other people's crimes, analyzing patterns, building cases from fragments of evidence. Now he was living inside the case itself, and every investigative instinct screamed that waiting for backup was exactly what Harrison Development expected. They'd held Emma for nearly 12 hours, plenty of time to move her if they suspected federal intervention. The construction site might be a trap, bait to lure him into a kill zone while they transported his daughter to another location, or worse, they might eliminate her the moment federal agents appeared on their surveillance cameras. Marcus had one advantage the FBI didn't. Harrison Development still thought he was operating alone, still believed he was a desperate father with no leverage and no allies. They'd be expecting him to arrive at midnight, broken and ready to surrender. They wouldn't anticipate an armed assault 2 hours early by someone with detailed intelligence about their security protocols. The radio erupted again as he reached the base of South Mountain. All units, we have movement at the target location, multiple vehicles departing the facility, possible hostage relocation in progress. Marcus's blood turned to ice water. They were moving Emma. In minutes, she'd disappear into Phoenix's sprawling urban maze, and all of Castellanos's careful planning would mean nothing. He abandoned any pretense of caution, taking the access road at 60 miles per hour, headlights off, using the night vision scope to navigate by ambient starlight. The construction site materialized ahead, a skeletal framework of steel and concrete that would become luxury condominiums built on 30 years of buried secrets. 3 vehicles sat in the compound, 2 black SUVs and a white panel van. Men moved between them with military precision, loading equipment and destroying evidence. Marcus could see Emma through the scope, hands zip-tied behind her back but alive and alert, being escorted toward the van by 2 guards. He had maybe 3 minutes before they drove away with his daughter. Marcus parked behind an equipment trailer and checked his weapon, chambering around with hands that no longer trembled. The scared, desperate father who'd bought a storage unit with his last $10 was gone. In his place was someone harder, someone shaped by 3 days of impossible choices and the weight of Victoria Ashford's legacy. The radio crackled one final time, Desert 1 to Phoenix Base. Federal units are 8 minutes out. Maintain surveillance only until tactical teams arrive. 8 minutes. Emma would be gone in 3. Marcus stepped into the Arizona night, following a path that had started with his daughter's safety and evolved into something larger. The completion of a 30-year investigation that had cost lives, destroyed careers, and finally found its ending in the hands of a single father who'd run out of options except the truth. Behind him, Castellanos's network continued its digital assault on Harrison Development's empire. Ahead, the final confrontation waited in the shadows of South Mountain, where justice and vengeance would finally converge under the desert stars. Marcus moved through the construction site like a ghost, every step calculated, every shadow utilized. 3 days of desperation had stripped away the cautious bureaucrat he'd once been, revealing something primal underneath, a father willing to kill to save his child. The first guard never saw him coming. Marcus emerged from behind a concrete mixer, the suppressed Glock whispering once in the desert air. The man crumpled silently, his radio clattering across the gravel. 20 yards away, Emma was being pushed toward the van, her captors focused on loading their equipment rather than watching their perimeter. Amateur mistake. Harrison Development had grown complacent after 30 years of operating without real opposition. Marcus reached the second guard as the man turned to check on his missing partner. Another whispered shot, another body hitting the ground. The insurance investigator and Marcus cataloged the scene with clinical detachment. 2 down, 4 visible targets remaining, hostage secured but mobile. "Where's Rodriguez?" one of the men called out, finally noticing the silence where radio chatter should have been. "Check the perimeter." But Marcus was already moving, using the skeletal steel framework like a jungle gym. His years of warehouse work had built practical strength, and the night vision scope revealed every shadow, every angle of approach. He climbed to the second level of the unfinished structure, gaining the high ground Castellanos's intelligence had identified as the tactical advantage. Below, chaos erupted as Harrison's men realized they were under attack. Flashlights swept the compound randomly, destroying their own night vision while Marcus tracked their movements from above. These weren't soldiers. They were glorified security guards, corporate muscle used to intimidating witnesses and disposing of evidence, not fighting someone who understood their playbook. Emma's guard pushed her behind the van, using her as human cover while shouting orders into his radio. "Desert Base, we're under assault. Unknown shooter, at least 2 men down. Requesting immediate backup." The response crackled through the night air. Negative, Desert Base. Federal surveillance is active. You are ordered to eliminate all assets and extract immediately. No witnesses, no evidence. Marcus felt ice crystallize in his chest. All assets included Emma. Harrison Development had just issued a kill order on his 12-year-old daughter. He dropped from the steel framework like an avenging spirit, landing behind 2 guards who were sweeping the ground level with automatic weapons. The first man died before he could turn around. The second managed to spin toward Marcus but caught a bullet through the center of his chest, his shot going wild into the desert sky. "Emma!" Marcus shouted, his voice carrying across the compound. "Stay down!" "Dad?" Her voice was small, terrified, but alive. Still alive. The remaining guards had taken defensive positions around the van, using it as cover while they tried to locate Marcus in the darkness. But he'd spent 3 days learning to think like Harrison Development, to anticipate their moves, to understand the cold calculus that valued profit over human life. They expected him to charge in blindly, a desperate father making emotional mistakes. Instead, Marcus circled wide, using the construction equipment as concealment, methodically eliminating their escape routes. Castellanos's intelligence had included the locations of fuel tanks, electrical panels, structural weak points. Marcus put a bullet through the van's engine block, then shot out the tires of both SUVs. Steam hissed from ruptured radiators, and hydraulic fluid began pooling on the ground. Harrison's team was now trapped in the compound with no transportation, no backup coming, and a federal net tightening around them. "You're surrounded," one of them shouted into the darkness. "FBI is 5 minutes out. Surrender now and we'll let your daughter live." But Marcus had heard the radio transmission. He knew what no witnesses meant. These men would kill Emma the moment they thought they could escape, or the moment they realized escape was impossible. Either way, his daughter was dead, unless he eliminated every threat in the next 4 minutes. The insurance investigator who'd built his career on methodical evidence gathering was gone. The warehouse worker who'd accepted poverty to pay for his mistakes was gone. The desperate father who'd gambled his last $10 on a storage unit was gone. In their place stood someone harder, someone forged by Victoria Ashford's 30-year quest for justice and tempered by the weight of Castellanos' sacrifice. Someone who understood that sometimes the only way to protect the innocent was to become exactly as ruthless as the monsters hunting them. Marcus checked his ammunition, 8 rounds remaining, and began his final approach toward the van where Emma waited. The radio crackled with incoming federal units, their tactical teams racing through the desert night. But justice delayed was justice denied, and his daughter had been in danger long enough. The last phase of the final test was about to begin. The compound fell silent except for the hiss of escaping steam and the distant rumble of federal vehicles approaching through the desert. Marcus crouched behind a bulldozer 30 yards from the van, counting heartbeats, measuring distances, calculating angles of fire. 2 guards remained, the one holding Emma and another positioned behind the van's rear bumper. "Rivera!" David Harrison's voice cut through the darkness. Marcus hadn't seen him arrive, but there he was, emerging from the shadows near the construction trailer like he'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. 30 years I've been cleaning up messes. Your daughter doesn't have to be another one." Marcus kept his weapon trained on the guard closest to Emma while Harrison stepped into the open, arms spread wide in a gesture of false reasonableness. Even now, facing the collapse of his empire, the man radiated the same corporate confidence that had let him bury Victoria Ashford's murder for 3 decades. "You think you've won something here?" Harrison continued, his voice carrying the practiced authority of board meetings and city council chambers. "You think federal agents change anything? I've survived investigations before. Prosecutors come and go, evidence disappears. But your daughter, she only dies once. Let her go. Marcus's voice was steady, cold. The trembling desperation of 3 days ago had crystallized into something harder. This is between us now. Harrison laughed, the sound echoing off unfinished concrete walls. Between us? You're nobody, Rivera, a failed insurance investigator who bought the wrong storage unit. You stumbled into something larger than your comprehension, and now you want to play hero? Through his scope, Marcus could see Emma pressed against the van's side panel, her eyes wide but alert. She wasn't crying, wasn't falling apart. 12 years old, and she was staying calm in a situation that would break most adults. Pride mixed with terror in his chest. Pride at her strength, terror at how close he was to losing her. Victoria Ashford was nobody too, Marcus replied, finger resting lightly on the trigger. Just a woman who asked the wrong questions about her father's money. How'd that work out for you? Harrison's composure cracked for the first time, his corporate mask slipping to reveal something uglier underneath. Victoria was a spoiled rich girl who couldn't accept that business requires difficult decisions. She would have destroyed hundreds of jobs, crashed the local economy, all for some abstract notion of justice. So you killed her. I protected what mattered. Just like I'm protecting it now. Harrison gestured to his remaining men. Phoenix PD responds to my calls first. Federal agents have to follow procedures, obtain warrants, respect jurisdictional boundaries. By the time they sort through the paperwork, you and your daughter will be tragic casualties of a drug deal gone wrong. Another warehouse worker who got involved with the wrong people. Marcus shifted position, using a concrete barrier to get a cleaner angle on Emma's guard. Sweat ran down his back despite the desert chill, and his mouth tasted like copper and fear. Every second that passed was another second for Harrison's backup plans to activate. Another chance for this rescue to become a bloodbath. But he'd learned patience during his insurance investigation years. Learned to wait for the perfect moment when all variables aligned. Harrison was talking because he believed time was on his side. Marcus was listening because patience had kept Emma alive this long. You know what I never understood? Marcus called out, keeping Harrison talking while he calculated the distance to Emma's position. Why keep the evidence? Why not destroy it all 30 years ago? Harrison's smile was sharp as broken glass. Insurance, Rivera. You should understand the concept. Victoria's evidence kept certain federal prosecutors honest, reminded local officials where their loyalties belonged. Dead witnesses can't testify, but hidden evidence can still destroy careers if it reaches the wrong hands. Like mine. Exactly like yours. The sound of helicopter rotors began echoing off the mountain faces, federal tactical units closing in fast. Harrison heard it too, his expression hardening as he realized his window for a clean resolution was collapsing. Last chance, Rivera. Drop your weapon, walk away, and your daughter lives to see 13. Keep playing hero and you both become part of the foundation we're pouring next week. Marcus rose from cover, the Glock steady in his hands, pointed directly at David Harrison's chest. Around them, the compound felt frozen in time, the hiss of steam, the approaching helicopters, Emma's quiet breathing audible in the sudden stillness. I've got a better offer, Marcus said, his voice carrying across 30 yards of Arizona desert where justice had waited 3 decades for this moment. Surrender now, and maybe you live to see a federal prison. Harrison's hand moved toward his jacket pocket. Emma's guard raised his weapon. The second gunman swung his rifle toward Marcus's position. And in that crystalline instant when everything balanced on a knife's edge, Marcus Rivera, former insurance investigator, warehouse worker, desperate father, made his choice. The choice crystallized in Marcus's mind with perfect clarity. He couldn't save both Emma and the evidence that would destroy Harrison development forever. His finger found the trigger as Harrison's hand closed around whatever weapon he kept in his jacket. But instead of firing at the man who'd orchestrated 30 years of murder and corruption, Marcus pivoted toward Emma's guard, the immediate threat to his daughter's life. The Glock whispered twice in rapid succession. Emma's captor crumpled, his rifle clattering across concrete. The second gunman's shot went wide as Marcus's third bullet found its mark, spinning the man into the van's rear panel where he slid to the ground in a spreading pool of blood. "Emma, run!" Marcus shouted, already moving toward her position while Harrison fumbled with his weapon. "Get to the fence line!" She didn't hesitate, didn't look back, just sprinted toward the compound's perimeter like he'd taught her during their weekend hikes through South Mountain. 12 years old, and she was following tactical instructions in a firefight, adapting to nightmare circumstances with a resilience that broke his heart even as it saved her life. Harrison's pistol cleared leather as Marcus dove behind a cement mixer, bullets sparking off steel and concrete where he'd been standing. The approaching helicopters were louder now, maybe 2 minutes out, but Harrison Development had spent 3 decades perfecting the art of eliminating problems quickly and quietly. "You think this changes anything?" Harrison called out, his voice echoing between the unfinished walls. "Even if federal agents arrest me tonight, the evidence dies with you. No photographs, no documents, no proof that Victoria Ashford ever existed." Marcus felt ice crystallize around his heart as he understood Harrison's final gambit. The man wasn't trying to escape. He was buying time for his cleanup crews to reach the storage facility, to destroy the archive that Castellanos had died protecting. Emma might survive tonight, but Victoria's justice would burn in industrial furnaces along with any hope of exposing the conspiracy. Through his earpiece, Santos's voice crackled with urgency. "Rivera, federal units are 90 seconds out. Maintain your position and wait for tactical support." But 90 seconds was exactly what Harrison needed. Marcus could hear vehicles approaching from the east, not federal agents, but Harrison Development's final solution racing toward Desert Star storage. In 2 minutes, Emma would be safe and the evidence would be destroyed, leaving him alive but hollow, knowing that 30 years of murder had been successfully buried forever. The radio in Harrison's hand crackled. "Desert Base cleanup crews are at the storage facility, awaiting final authorization to proceed." Harrison's laugh was triumphant despite the blood running down his arm from Marcus's near miss. "Your choice, Rivera. Save your daughter or save your conscience. You can't have both." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of Victoria Ashford's photographs in his jacket pocket, the ones he'd kept with him through 3 days of impossible decisions. She stared back at him across 30 years of silence, a young woman who died for asking questions that powerful men didn't want answered. He pulled out his phone and speed-dialed the number Castellanos had programmed before his death. "This is Marcus Rivera," he said when the line connected. "Authorization code Victor Alpha 7. Upload everything. Now." The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats before Harrison realized what was happening. "You son of a bitch. That's not possible. We destroyed Castellanos' network." Marcus stood up from cover, weapon trained on Harrison's center mass. Around them, the desert night was filled with the sound of approaching justice. Helicopters, tactical vehicles, federal agents racing to end a conspiracy that had poisoned Phoenix for 3 decades. "You destroyed his physical network," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he'd just sacrificed. "But Carlos was an insurance investigator, just like me. We always keep backup copies." The truth was simpler and more devastating. Castellanos had uploaded Victoria's complete archive to a dead man's switch, programmed to release everything to federal servers, news organizations, and social media platforms if he failed to check in for 72 hours. Marcus's authorization code had simply accelerated the timeline. Harrison's face went white as he understood the scope of his defeat. 30 years, he whispered. 30 years of building, of protecting what matters. Gone, Marcus finished. Just like Victoria, just like Castellanos, just like every life you destroyed to protect your empire. The first federal helicopter thundered overhead, searchlights turning night into day. Harrison raised his weapon one final time, but Marcus was ready. The insurance investigator who'd spent his career building cases from fragments of evidence had finally closed the most important investigation of his life. As Harrison Development's architect fell to the desert floor, Marcus felt something profound settle in his chest. Not satisfaction, but completion. Emma was safe, running toward federal agents who would protect her forever. Victoria Ashford's evidence was uploading to servers that couldn't be bought or intimidated. Justice, delayed by 30 years, had finally found its moment under the Arizona stars. The silence that followed was profound, not empty, but full of endings. Marcus lowered his weapon as federal agents swarmed the compound, their tactical lights cutting through darkness that had concealed murder for 30 years. The weight of Harrison's final breath seemed to echo off the unfinished concrete, carrying with it the ghosts of Victoria Ashford, Detective Castellanos, and everyone who died protecting or pursuing the truth. "Dad!" Emma's voice cut through the chaos, and Marcus turned to see her running back from the fence line, federal agents flanking her like protective shadows. She crashed into his arms with the desperate force of a 12-year-old who'd stared death in the face and survived, her small body trembling against his chest. "It's over," he whispered into her hair, the words feeling strange on his tongue. For 3 days, survival had been measured in minutes and heartbeats. The concept of over seemed almost foreign, too large to comprehend. Agent Santos approached, her weapon holstered but her expression grim. Harrison's cleanup crews were arrested at the storage facility 20 minutes ago. They hadn't started the destruction process yet. "Everything's intact." She paused, studying Marcus's face. Castellanos' dead man's switch was beautiful work. "The evidence is already hitting news feeds across the country. Harrison Development's stock price has crashed, and the Attorney General is calling for a special prosecutor." Marcus nodded, feeling strangely detached from the magnitude of what they'd accomplished. Victoria Ashford's photographs were uploading to servers in Washington, New York, Atlanta, digital justice spreading across fiber optic cables at the speed of light. But all he could focus on was Emma's heartbeat against his chest, steady and strong and alive. "The reward money will take time to process," Santos continued. "Federal bureaucracy moves slowly, even for something this significant. But there are already calls from documentary filmmakers, book publishers, interview requests from major networks. The story of a warehouse worker who brought down a 30-year conspiracy, that's worth millions in itself." Emma pulled back to look at him, her eyes red-rimmed but fierce. "Are we really going to be rich, Dad?" Marcus managed a smile, brushing dirt from her cheek. "We're going to be safe. That's better than rich." But even as he said it, he could see the transformation beginning around them. Federal agents were treating him with a deference that had nothing to do with his warehouse worker's uniform. Santos had shifted from interrogating him to consulting with him, recognizing that he possessed knowledge about the conspiracy that would be crucial for the prosecution phase. His phone buzzed with incoming calls, reporters who'd somehow gotten his number in the 20 minutes since the story broke. Text messages from neighbors who'd seen his name on breaking news alerts. Emma's school principal wanting to discuss security arrangements. The Phoenix mayor's office requesting a meeting. "Mr. Rivera?" A young federal agent approached, tablet in hand. "We need to discuss protective custody arrangements." Harrison Development had extensive networks, and while the primary threat has been eliminated, there may be secondary actors who view you and your daughter as loose ends. Marcus felt Emma's grip tighten on his arm. Even in victory, even with Harrison dead and the evidence uploaded to federal servers, their safety remained conditional. Wealth couldn't buy them anonymity anymore. They were now permanent fixtures in a story that would reshape Phoenix politics for decades. "What does that mean exactly?" he asked. "Relocation assistance if you want it. New identities, federal oversight until we're certain all threats have been neutralized, or enhanced security at your current residence if you prefer to stay local." The agent's tone was professional but sympathetic. This kind of exposure comes with risks that don't disappear overnight. Marcus looked down at Emma, seeing his own exhaustion reflected in her young face. 3 days ago, their biggest worry had been keeping the electricity turned on. Now they faced decisions about witness protection and media management, about congressional testimony and federal reward disbursements. "Can we go home tonight?" Emma asked quietly. "To our real home, not some safe house?" The agent consulted his tablet. "We can arrange security detail." "Yes," Marcus interrupted. understanding what his daughter needed. "We can go home tonight. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." As they walked toward the federal vehicles that would transport them back to their small apartment in South Phoenix, Marcus felt the profound weight of transition settling around them. Victoria Ashford's 30-year quest for justice was complete, but his own story, their story, was just beginning. Emma slipped her hand into his as they reached the convoy. "Dad, what happens to people like us when everything changes?" Marcus squeezed her fingers, looking back once at the compound where Harrison Development's empire had finally crumbled. "We learn to carry the change," he said softly, "and we remember who we were before it happened." The desert stars watched them drive away, justice finally served under the Arizona sky. The convoy moved through Phoenix's sleeping streets like a ghost procession, federal vehicles maintaining perfect formation as they carried Marcus and Emma back to a world that no longer quite fit them. Marcus watched familiar landmarks roll past, the Circle K where he'd bought Emma's birthday cake with food stamps, the intersection where his car had broken down last winter, the warehouse where he'd clocked in for what now seemed like a lifetime ago. Everything looked smaller somehow, as if the events of the past 3 days had shifted his perspective on a fundamental level. The apartment complex that had felt like home yesterday now seemed temporary, a way station for people they used to be. "Will Mrs. Patterson still hate us?" Emma asked quietly, referring to their perpetually angry neighbor who'd complained about everything from Emma's skateboard to Marcus's late-night job search phone calls. Marcus almost smiled, probably more than before. "We're going to be famous for a while." The federal agents maintained their perimeter as Marcus unlocked their front door, muscle memory guiding his key into the familiar lock. But stepping inside felt like entering a museum exhibit. Portrait of a struggling family, circa 3 days ago. Their poverty was preserved in careful detail, the stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter, Emma's homework spread across the dining table they'd rescued from a garage sale, his work boots still muddy from the warehouse floor. Emma moved through the space like she was relearning it, touching familiar objects with careful fingers. Her textbooks, her skateboard leaning against the wall, the framed photo of her mother that Marcus kept on the mantel despite the pain it brought. These things belonged to a girl whose biggest worry had been whether they could afford new sneakers before school started. "It feels different," she said, settling onto the couch they'd bought with his first warehouse paycheck. Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The apartment hadn't changed, but they had. He was no longer just a man who'd lost his career in an insurance scandal. He was someone who'd brought down a conspiracy that had shaped Phoenix politics for 3 decades. Emma was no longer just a 12-year-old whose father worked 3 jobs. She was a survivor who'd faced down killers and lived to tell about it. His phone buzzed again. More reporters, more interview requests. A text from his former supervisor at the warehouse. "Holy shit, Marcus. Saw the news. Call me." Another from Emma's teacher. "Let me know when Emma's ready to come back to school. We'll handle the media attention." The reality of their transformation was hitting in waves. Federal reward money that would eliminate their financial struggles forever. Book deals and documentary rights that could set up Emma's college fund with money to spare. But also security details and death threats, congressional testimony and media scrutiny that would follow them for years. Marcus set his phone aside and joined Emma on the couch, the familiar cushions creaking under his weight. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, processing the magnitude of how completely their lives had changed. "Do you think Mom would be proud?" Emma asked suddenly. The question hit harder than any bullet Harrison's men had fired. Maria Rivera had died believing her husband was a failure, that his insurance career had ended in scandal because he'd made serious mistakes in judgment. She'd never known the truth, that Marcus had gotten too close to exposing corruption that went all the way to the state capitol, that his mistakes had been carefully orchestrated to destroy his credibility before he could reveal what he'd discovered. "Yes," Marcus said quietly, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "She'd be proud of both of us, of how we survived, how we fought back, how we never gave up on each other." Emma leaned against his shoulder, and Marcus felt the profound shift in their relationship. 3 days ago, he'd been her protector, the adult who shouldered burdens so she could focus on homework and friends and the simple concerns of childhood. Now she was his partner, someone who'd proven she could face impossible circumstances with courage he was still processing. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked. Marcus considered the question seriously. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and reporters, federal agents and financial advisors. Tomorrow would bring decisions about their future that he'd never imagined having the luxury to make. Tomorrow would bring the responsibility of testimony that could put powerful people in federal prison for the rest of their lives. But tonight, they were still just a father and daughter who'd found their way home after the hardest fight of their lives. "Tomorrow we start figuring out who we are now," Marcus said, watching desert stars through their living room window. "But tonight, we remember who we were when this all started." Outside, federal agents maintained their watch, protecting a warehouse worker and his daughter who'd accidentally changed the world with a $10 storage unit bid. The new beginning. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the kitchen of their new house, watching Emma pack her lunch with the casual efficiency of someone who no longer worried about whether there would be food in the refrigerator tomorrow. The granite countertops and stainless steel appliances still felt surreal sometimes, artifacts from a life he was still learning to inhabit. "Dad, you're staring again," Emma said without looking up from her sandwich construction. At 13 now, she'd grown taller and more confident, but she still preferred peanut butter and jelly to the gourmet options their transformed circumstances could afford. "Just thinking," Marcus replied, adjusting his tie. Federal testimony required business attire, and after 6 months of court appearances, he still felt like he was playing dress-up in someone else's clothes. The house was quiet except for the gentle hum of central air conditioning, a luxury that felt profound to someone who'd spent years calculating whether they could afford to run the window unit. Through the breakfast room windows, he could see the security system's discreet cameras and the unmarked federal vehicle that still maintained periodic surveillance. Some threats took time to fully neutralize. Emma shouldered her backpack, a designer model they'd chosen together during their awkward transition into wealth. "How long will today's testimony take?" "A few hours. The Harrison development trial is entering its final phase." Marcus checked his watch, a gift from Agent Santos when the federal investigation concluded. "Are you sure you don't want to transfer schools? We could find somewhere with less media attention." "Dad, we've talked about this. I'm not running from being Emma Rivera." She stood straighter, and Marcus saw flashes of the courage that had carried her through their darkest moments. "Besides, Madison High has a really good journalism program. Someone should tell these stories the right way." Marcus felt his throat tighten with pride and concern in equal measure. Emma had chosen to lean into their transformed circumstances rather than hide from them. But 13 was young to carry the weight of being a public figure. Child psychologists assured him she was processing the trauma appropriately, but he still watched for signs that the pressure was becoming too much. The morning routine they'd developed felt both familiar and strange. Coffee from an expensive machine, breakfast at a table large enough for a family twice their size, conversation about federal trials and security protocols instead of overdue bills and whether the car would start. They'd kept some elements from their old life: Saturday morning pancakes, Emma's Wednesday skateboard sessions, their tradition of terrible movie marathons when Marcus wasn't traveling for testimony or interviews. "The documentary crew wants to film our lunch tomorrow," Emma mentioned casually, spreading peanut butter with scientific precision. "I told them we'd think about it." Marcus nodded, still adjusting to the reality that their story had become public property in ways both lucrative and invasive. 3 book deals, 2 documentary projects, and a feature film adaptation that made him profoundly uncomfortable. Victoria Ashford's quest for justice had become entertainment, but Emma was right. Someone needed to ensure the story was told with integrity. His phone buzzed with a text from their financial advisor. "College fund and trust are fully established. Emma will never need to worry about money again." The message should have brought relief, but Marcus found himself missing the clarity that came with simpler problems. When survival was the goal, every decision had obvious priorities. "Are you nervous?" Emma asked, studying his face with the perceptiveness that had sharpened during their ordeal. About testimony? No. Harrison Development's remaining executives will be convicted based on evidence, not my performance. Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. I'm nervous about what comes after, when the trials end, when the media attention fades, when it's just us figuring out who we are now. Emma finished her sandwich and sealed it in a container that cost more than their weekly grocery budget used to be. We're still us, Dad. We just have better kitchen appliances. The simplicity of her perspective made him smile. Emma had adapted to wealth with the resilience of youth, but she'd also maintained the values forged in their years of struggle. She volunteered at the food bank on weekends, donated most of her allowance to charity, and had convinced Marcus to establish a scholarship fund for children of single parents. You're going to change the world someday, Marcus said, meaning it completely. I already did. We both did. Emma kissed his cheek, a gesture that had become more precious since they'd nearly lost the chance to share ordinary moments like these. Victoria would be proud of how far her story has traveled. As Emma headed to school and Marcus prepared for another day of testimony, he reflected on the profound transformation that had begun with a $10 storage unit bid. They'd found justice for Victoria Ashford and security for themselves, but more importantly, they'd discovered strength they'd never known they possessed. Outside, Phoenix stretched toward the desert horizon, a city slowly healing from 30 years of corruption. Marcus Rivera, former warehouse worker and accidental hero, locked his front door and headed toward a federal courthouse where truth would triumph once again. The investigation was over, but their new beginning continued.